The Marinade.
There's no O in Marinade. Let's try it one more time. Ready? 1, 2, 3.
The Marinade.
Marinade.
Bone marinade.
That's
The Marinade.
The Marinade. With Jason Earle.
Wheels down in another town. I thought you said you'd stick around, and I wonder now if love is gonna cost my life. Something in my chest feels like a butcher knife. 4 days in a hotel, we'll be going home.
Welcome to The Marinade with Jason Earle, a free-flowing conversation about the creative process with creative people. This is the lost episode 50, and our guest is me, Jason Earle. One of my earliest thought partners for what would become The Marinade was my good friend, Peter Haroldson. Peter's one of the best people I know, y'all. He's kind, hilarious, and wildly intelligent, and I'm grateful to call him my friend. When The Marinade first began, the idea of getting to episode number 50 seemed like some kind of far-off abstraction. Would anybody even care about this thing? Would we make it that far? Well, thankfully, a lot of you do care, and before long, episode 50 was a reality. See, the plan, as suggested by Peter, was that episode 50 would be a conversation between the two of us where Peter's doing the asking of the questions and I'm the interview subject. Well, when we got to episode 50, Peter had moved to Minnesota. And then right thereafter, the world shut down due to the COVID-19 crisis. And finally, in October of 2021, I flew to Minneapolis-St, Minnesota, and sat down on the other side of the desk to answer some questions from my friend. If you're new to the show, this might be a good entrance point. Just know that I'm usually the one doing the asking, not the answering of the questions for the most part. A couple of production notes either way. My voice was a little scratchy because my allergies were flaring. I tried to edit out every cough and sniffle. It took forever, but a few of them just could not be helped. Also, we're sitting outside. It was a beautiful Minnesota October night. And there's a fire going, and it's a little windy. Don't worry about it. It shouldn't be too distracting, but I didn't want you messing with your settings, thinking that there was some sort of connection issue or something. That crackling that you hear is just the fire around which we were sitting to chat. I would have preferred to have waited until a time when my voice was cooperating, but who knows when Peter and I will get another chance to do this, so the show must go on. Also, I want to thank my good friend Patrick Hagerman, whose tune Minneapolis is serving as the soundtrack to this episode. Patrick is hard at work on an album, and we're going to bring you a conversation with him as soon as it's out in the world. This song, Minneapolis, is a little taste of his incredible writing. Anytime I even hear the word Minneapolis, this song plays in my head, and it just made it a natural fit for this episode. Peter and I talked for over 2 hours, and rather than ask you to consume all of that in one sitting, this episode is going to be part 1 of 2. Part 2 is going to be released over on Patreon, patreon.com/Marinade Podcast, where you can access that episode and much more bonus Marinade content for as little as $2 a month. Everyone, it is my pleasure to bring you the lost episode 50, where Peter Haroldson interviews me, Jason Earle.
If I don't freeze in Minneapolis, I can make it by myself. If I don't freeze in Minneapolis, I'll make it by myself. What's it to you anyway?
Just want to get out there and say it. Hail Satan.
You've got other games to play. I mistook your compliments for loyalty.
Jason Earle. All right.
I guess I should be thankful for your feeding me,
Hold it steady.
pointing out my flaws,
Got it.
personality. My late 30s over sexuality. Over sexuality.
Hey, buddy. What do you
Oh, I
want?
can't help it.
I want to introduce you.
I love you.
I'm here
I
with
can't help it.
Jason Earle, the host of the Marinade,
That's me.
recording episode 50.
The lost episode 50.
It's just not lost, delayed.
Delayed, true.
Last night we got to go see a truckers show, and they described it as it was a delayed show, and they said, sorry, it took us 16 months to get here. So
Yeah.
I feel like it's just similar.
Yeah.
Sorry, it took us 2 years to get here.
Right. It's crazy that it has taken 2 years. It's crazy that episode 50 came up so quickly.
Well, right.
You
Because
know?
this idea spawned like maybe episode 5 to 10, somewhere in that
really
range.
early, yeah.
And we were talking about the idea of interviewing yourself because you are a creative, and the word navel gazing was thrown around quite a bit. And
Appropriately applied.
appropriately, but I think it's important that
Oh,
you know.
man. I'm in for it on this. All right.
Yeah. Well, for those listeners too, I think it's important to note that making the podcast, that is a creative art, and no different than any of the people you've interviewed, many of whom have their own podcasts.
Right. I certainly consider it as such.
Well, I mean, it's not the first creative endeavor you've done, though, right?
No.
I mean, so what do you think? What do you think's different about making the Marinade
Then
compared to your past writing, performing?
Huh. That's a good question. Well, the other stuff is very dependent on the guest. The podcast, I mean, the other stuff is dependent on me. The podcast is dependent on the guest. I think I'm much more cognizant of the audience with the podcast. I'm certainly trying to make the show that I want to listen to, and I'm trying to make the show that I would find interesting. But I'm at the whims of the guest to a large extent. I can kind of steer the conversation one way or the other if I want to, but at the same time, it's more important to me to catch what the guest wants to talk about, because I think that ends up being much more compelling than like this fire's attacking me, than what I want out of the guest.
Well, I think that's a good point, but I don't know. I think that's selling it a little short, right? Because I agree with you in the sense that you can steer the guest a little bit and try and... I think you have a very strong talent at focusing in, like you said, identifying what the guest wants to talk about and really trying to play towards that.
Yeah.
But to that point, I think that's a strength that you have that not everybody has, right? The idea is if you put me in front of the microphone interviewing those guests, you're going to get probably a worse interview.
Well, it'd be a different interview for sure, but thank you, first of all. But I also, like, I think with the other stuff, with guitar or songwriting, well, yeah, songwriting, essay writing, fiction writing, but those other things, I pretty much only do it for me. I mean, the Marinade has become a different thing in that now we have this community built that I had no idea that was going to happen. And so it's not like I'm hyper aware of audience in the sense of, I'm just going to play to the audience. I'm still going to book the guests I want to talk to. I'm still going to ask the things I want to ask and then go in the direction that the guest and I want to go, because the conversation is going to be organic too. That's the other thing about that maybe is similar to the other creative endeavors, is that you don't really necessarily know until you get in the middle of it what's going to happen. So if you're writing an essay, you may have an outline for it and know what you intend to do, but a lot of times, with me, it's almost every time, I'm going to end up going some other direction I didn't expect. The same thing's true for a short story or the novel that I've been working on. We talked a little bit about this last night, how I set out with this one idea in mind for the characters in my novel and the story arc. And then I just fell in love with another character, and I went down a totally different road. And I think there's a parallel there with interviewing people for the Marinade, because a conversation's by nature going to be organic, and you're going to have surprises from your guests. I got a really good compliment from Casey Anderson recently that I greatly appreciated, where he listened to the Todd Snyder episode, and this is on my last episode with Casey. I listened to Todd Snyder episode, and he said a lot of times people have an idea of what they want from Todd, and they seek out that thing, interviewers do, but that he said I didn't do that I kind of let Todd go in one direction and I went with him, and then it made for a more compelling interview than a lot that he's heard or read from Todd. And I think that kind of sums up the lesson that I learned early on about interviewing people, is that if I'm going to ask somebody for their time, somebody I find interesting, I got to be careful not to try to impose my expectations of them on them.
So I want to focus on something you said there too, because you said, that your other endeavors were more for you, right? And I think that I can see that, having read your stuff for a while now, more of your essay work, I understand saying, hey, I want to get my idea out, and here's how I'm doing it, right? I'm expressing out to the world versus, at the whim. When do you think you picked up on that for the Marinade? Was that like episode 1, you're interviewing BJ, and you're like, oh, this is different? Was it before that? When do you think you came into that idea of realizing like, oh, this is a different beast here?
I think it was before that. I think I was fortunate in that I'd written about music and interviewed artists for a few years before I started the Marinade, and I'd failed a lot in a short amount of time, because when I started interviewing artists and writing about music, I just sort of poured myself into it. And so I was doing a lot of interviews, and I was doing a lot of so-called music journalism, which was more me kind of writing about my experiences at shows and listening to records. And it didn't take long. And I think that's the understanding of my understanding of conversation goes back even further than that, Mm-hmm. I think growing up an only child, I kind of had to make friends pretty early, because I now would just say I'm more introverted, but I was an extroverted only child growing up. And I was fortunate in that I grew up around a lot of kids, and even though I was in a kind of mid-sized town, I went to a pretty decent-sized high school, in that mid-sized town, and I was able to make friends from a fairly early age. And that probably was because I needed that human connection. And while I had a wonderful core family, there weren't any other kids, so in my family. So people my age. So I developed that skill early on that ended up translating into what became the Marinade. Because the Marinade I hope it's not. It really isn't me interviewing an artist. It is what I say it is. A free-flowing conversation about the creative process, and I happen to be having it with creatives who I respect. But it isn't a traditional interview. I don't have an editor. I don't have I work with publicists, but they know what I do. They're not gonna, I'm gonna talk about the new record or whatever, of course, because I'm interested in it, not because it's a talking point. And so I think that understanding came really early. Also, I was super ignorant about all of that because I didn't come up the traditional way, and this is the beauty of the sort of egalitarian ideal, or democratic, maybe not egalitarian, but democratic ideal of the internet, is that I didn't go to journalism school. I didn't have any preconceived notions of what interviewing people looked like other than what I'd listened to and read. And I listened to and read a ton of that stuff, I read Rolling Stone for years and years and years, and back when Maxim had that magazine Blender, I subscribed to that and would read it. I would read all of the music magazines I could get my hands on, especially in the years leading up to starting to write about music and interviewing artists. So the combination of kind of having conversational skills already, and then also having read a lot of interviews that I could pick pieces from and go, well, I like the way this person did it, but I'm not so crazy about the way this person did it. Like, that bored me, but this I found more interesting. And I found that the things I found more interesting were the things artists found more interesting. And ultimately, that almost always points back to process. And that's where the idea from the Marinade was born. So I think it goes kind of hand in hand, the idea that, like, early on I figured out how I wanted it to go because I picked up on artists getting bored with my line of questioning.
So what was the moment, at the time, like you said, you're cutting your teeth on a lot of writing about music, a little bit of interviewing. What do you think was the moment where you went, I want to make this a podcast. I want to make this more conversational format?
Well, the idea of the podcast was inspired by you turning me on to Pete Holmes. You Made It Weird.
It was a roundabout compliment I was looking for. That question. Good. Yeah. I'm glad I tricked you into it.
You got me into podcasts. I thought I wouldn't. I just dismissed them. I didn't have any problem with them. I just dismissed them at first. And I think the reason why is because I'm so obsessed with music. So anytime I would be listening to a podcast, I was listening to music. And then you started talking about Pete's show, and I don't want to give Pete too much free pub. He's doing fine.
He's doing all right.
Yeah, but when you started talking about how he would talk about existential questions, and he always, I don't know if he still does, I haven't listened as much as in the past, but how he ends with the question of, like, sort of what is this whole cosmic thing? Like, what do you believe about religion and spirituality? And then also being a comedian and having comedians on, there would be funny moments, and he would talk about relationships and all these things. And I thought, oh, I guess, okay, I got to give this a shot. And that's when my partner Chris and I started dating, and we were 2 hours apart, and that show was 2 hours long. So it became like a companion to me, and the podcast, his podcast, became a constant companion in the way that records would have in the before. But there was an emotional connection now, because now I was driving 2 hours to meet my love, on the weekend or whatever, and Pete was my buddy hanging out with me on the way there. Yeah, so it became something different. And that's, I guess, where it clicked. Is I went, oh, okay, I really enjoy this medium, and I'm writing about musicians, I'm interviewing these musicians, and then I have to distill that experience, because I was having these amazing experiences, and I'm not sure if it was one particular interview or another, where I think it just kept happening, where I would have these amazing experiences talking to these musicians that I love and respected, and then I would write the piece, and I'd be proud of the written interview, but it did not even come close to capturing the moment. There's just no, whether I'm just not good enough, or it just the writing is just too restrictive to allow for it, or maybe some combination of the two. I feel like people would really be interested in those moments, those true human moments that I was having with people that I thought were just incredible. I'm interviewing Jim Lauderdale, this legendary songwriter, and who's done all these amazing things, and then I'm writing about it. I'm like, well, wait a minute. We sat in that green room, and, like, he offered me a beer, and I think that's pretty fun, and I think that's pretty cool, and I think the average listener, whatever that means, the average listener, I think most people would find that also pretty fun, that we were having that experience. And so I wanted to capture a little bit of that and not have it be just journalist asking questions, artist answering questions. And even if I write about Jim offering me a beer, even if I write about that experience, it's not the same as hearing him actually say, like, in the background, hey, can I get you a brew? Or,
right.
Would you like some water? Because the human element of Jim Lauderdale, who's written #1 hits for George Strait, he just become, instead of the guy who wrote #1 hits for George Strait and hits for other people, and then also made his own amazing records and recorded with Ralph Stanley and on and on and on and on. Instead of that, it's the guy offering you a brew And that doesn't come through in a written piece the way that it would in the podcast
Or
format.
you've got an audience who's asking, well, why did he include that detail about the written, about him
Yeah.
offering you a beer?
Yeah.
Was it to humanize him, this legend? Or is it rather, I get you, in the podcast medium, it's there because I'm capturing the whole experience, or I'm capturing a wider experience.
That's a great point. Yeah. Like with writing, we naturally dissect the author's motivations.
Yep.
And maybe some podcasts, maybe some people do that with some podcasts, and maybe they do that with the Marinade, but I don't think so. I think people understand that I'm trying to capture the most authentic,
Right.
the most authentic representation of what this experience was like with this artist. And to a person, everybody has been nice, accommodating, open, and varying degrees, of course, of
Sure.
that. And some people you make a deeper connection with. Some people have become friends that I've interviewed. But to a person, they've all been these wonderful people in person. And I want people to get to actually experience that, get a feel for this is what this person's actually like. Even though the mic is on, it's the same thing that I was capturing when the mic was off. It's not like they flipped a switch. And I think that's what I've tried to cultivate. I keep saying curate when I mean cultivate today. That's what I've been trying to cultivate with the Marinade, is the idea of a very natural conversation with these people who are creating magic. And how do you distill that down to a normal conversation? And I think we're able to capture that because it, before long, feels like the mics are off. And when the mics are off, that's when the really special moments happen, or when it feels like the mics are off, I should say.
Right.
And when you forget the mic is there, that's when the magic really happens. And I think we've been able to, through the so-called structure of the free-flowing conversation of the show, been able to capture that for over 100 episodes now.
Well, I think it speaks to your. I think one of the reasons why I find the Marinade compelling to listen to is, not just having known you as a friend, but I think to the point that in some people's hands, that idea of wanting to have those, mic-free moments, right, of conversation, would, seem disingenuous almost, right? I'm trying to relax their guard so I get the true look. But I feel like you, as a person, would have the same conversation, mics on, mics off, and you are having the conversation because you are fascinated in the person in front of you, and you're interested in, you love the process, and you love hearing different people's process.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's a strength of the podcast, is the host, right? Which I want to circle back, because I think it's interesting to when you think about, we talked about, hey, I've been cultivating conversational skills for years, and obviously writing, but podcasting is its own medium. It's its own cadence. It's got its own things, setting up mics, the least of it, just not even just the technical stuff, but like you said, just figuring out a rhythm and figuring out a way to get into this.
Yeah.
And to think about the fact of, you said basically, hey, I'm self-taught in so many different disciplines, writing, included interviewing. The idea that you basically listened quite extensively to one podcast and then basically started doing it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's not the turnaround of years of these building up these skills. So what do you think was the impetus behind that? To want to, diving back into that, what was compelling in terms of, I want to switch to this medium? And what do you think are the things that were challenging, especially at the start?
Oh, I love that question. There were so many challenges. Well, to the first part of the question, I think the challenge of, so they kind of go together. The challenge of doing this thing I really didn't know anything about, other than as a listener, right? Like I didn't know anything about audio. I still don't know much. I didn't know anything about editing audio, not even the first bit about it. And I still don't know much. But I thought that was pretty interesting, and to shout out Chris again, my partner Chris, like, she was in film school when this whole thing started. I think she graduated that right after I started the Marinade. And so I would see her do film editing, and I found that really interesting. And while it wasn't something I wanted to do necessarily, I did want to kind of scratch a bit of the creative itch in that way. And I thought that the audio part of it would be interesting as a creative outlet in itself. And while podcast editing, at least the way that I do it, like I don't do a lot of complicated editing, right? Like there's not much to most of the work, the post-production work after I've recorded an interview is writing and then me recording the intro and what used to be what I'm getting down on and now has been review under 2. That's where most of that stuff goes. And then also just like thinking about certain choices in terms of where, how I'm going to edit the intro going into the song and then the song going into the build up to the episode. But those are kind of simple to someone who knows what they're doing. Mm-hmm. I didn't know what I was doing, right? So like there was nothing, especially early on, nothing simple about that. Like,
I've heard the phrase layering. Is that something I need to do?
There's hours, dude. There's hours. I mean, now it doesn't take me as long. It's still. I'm still work in progress. I'm still learning all the time about audio. But at the beginning of the show, I had no idea. So it was a fun challenge. Like I remember we talked earlier about. We've been talking about public libraries a lot this weekend. We're here at your house in Minneapolis, and I came to visit, and so we talked about books as we always do. We talked about libraries. And thankfully the local library had a you get a subscription to lynda.com where you can learn all kinds of stuff. So I watched a ton of videos before I ever recorded the first episode. I watched a ton of videos on auto editing and took notes and then practiced a little bit, just like me talking to Chris or like me talking to myself or before the BJ episode, I didn't know what I was doing with that. Like I downloaded a program a couple days before that could record phone calls through a computer, and I called him on Google Voice, and like I called my dad before that and recorded with my dad for a while just to see if I knew what I was doing, and then try to edit that into something, which probably it's not going to be released as any bonus content, everybody. It's nothing.
Marinade lost tapes right there.
Yeah, I don't think you want
It'll be in
one.
the Japanese box set.
Yeah, if you subscribe to the Patreon, I'll do better than that. So I think there was a whole nother creative outlet then, right? So not just the podcast itself and the creative process behind making the podcast, but a specific step in that process is audio editing and recording that as kind of entry level as it is and still is in the way I do it, I learn a lot and it's fun to learn about, which then also informs, especially when I talk to musicians, informs conversations I have with musicians too. It's not like we talk a ton about that because I don't want to get too wonky, because you're going to lose some people, and I don't want to listen to something too wonky either.
Sure.
About technicalities and stuff of recording, but it helps me to understand. It helps me to empathize with an artist and what they've made when they make their record. It helps me to empathize with people who produce their own records or other people's records, and informs the questions that I might ask them. So I saw an opportunity there to learn about that and to kind of scratch that itch. And then the challenges were born out of that same thing, is that, when I first started, I had free software. I didn't have this recorder we're using right now. I had these mics because I did a ton of research on what mics were good entry level mics. But I plugged them straight into a computer, a Toshiba laptop. The first several episodes are recorded that way. I think the Trey Crowder episode was the last one, and the only reason it was the last one that was recorded straight into the computer is because Corey Ryan Forster walked in the room and saw my setup and very gently told me, like, you don't want to do this. Like, here's what you need to get, and told me what to get. Very gently and diplomatically, Corey was like, what the fuck are you doing, man?
I'm sure that was a. I'm sure you don't wake up in sweats in the night anytime, just being like, oh man.
He was so good about it. And Corey's a sweetheart and has been so good at the show. It doesn't have to be an is, shout out to Corey Ryan Forster and all the well-read guys. And so many people have come to the show through them, and I think they're doing important work too. But anyway, the first 4 or 5 episodes were recorded straight into the laptop, and buddy, there was like a couple that Jim Lauderdale's a good example. I recorded with Jim Lauderdale and it just wasn't salvageable.
Oof.
Yeah, so I spent like
brutal.
it took like an hour of a legend's time.
Yeah.
You know, I felt awful, and he and his people he didn't care. You know, everybody's super nice, but I almost didn't really. And Peter Rowan too. I have a whole interview with Peter Rowan, who was in Bill Monroe's Bluegrass Boys. That just it's not worth releasing because the audio is just such garbage. And he's talking about like the tree frogs at Swanee and how climate change. He doesn't use the word climate change, but it's clear how there's no more tree frogs, and he used to miss the tree frogs, or he misses the tree frogs, and he's like talking on this like metaphysical level about all these heavy things and all the beauty in the world. And he's telling stories about traveling with Bill Monroe and the birth of bluegrass music and like you know, so like all of this. The birth of bluegrass music. That's it's deeper than that, I know, but you know, it's still like Bill Monroe's the father of bluegrass, right? Yeah. So like Peter Rowan was there playing in Bill Monroe's band, right? He was.
It's like taping over a conversation with your grandfather and being like, "Well, there's a part of history that is gone now."
And that one we talked about like Bill Monroe's bus breaking down outside of the town my dad was born in, you know, Horse Cave, Kentucky, and so early on, there were some disappointments like that, you know, some really heavy disappointments, but they just motivated me to learn more. And then I think interview-wise, so the technical part was probably the hardest part early on because I felt pretty confident with the conversation.
Right.
But even if you listen early on and you listen now, I rarely go back and listen to early stuff because I think I've learned the lessons I need to learn from the early ones. But if you listen early on, like I'm still kind of green, you know? And I had, in the first 10 episodes, I've got Colonel Bruce Hampton, who like founded jam music. He's like a father of jam band music in the South. I've got James McMurtry, Oliver Wood, B.J. Barham, Seth Walker, Trey Crowder. This is on the first 10 episodes. Yep. So, you know, I think it kind of motivated me like, wait, people like this thing.
Yeah.
People are saying yes, and publicists aren't going to put their people in front of somebody they don't trust to do a good job. So I just decided to step up, you know, and invest a little bit of my own coin and some infrastructure. We've been talking about bike infrastructure all week. It's got me thinking about infrastructure.
Shout out to Minneapolis' bike infrastructure,
man,
getting us around the city.
Seriously, I love the bike infrastructure here. But equipment, and then do some more research about that technical part of it and practice some more and get better at it. But that was one of the biggest challenges. The other big challenge I think early on is that, dude, I do not want anything to do with marketing. Like I like designing t-shirt and like,
sure,
you know, I love the hats and the shirts and the stickers. That's fun, but I don't know what I'm doing. First of all,
helps when you have a great artist that lives under the same roof.
It does help to have an in-house artist, Chris Osborne, who does all of the artwork for the show, and
really captures your face in a beautiful profile.
Hey, I met some folks in Nashville. Shout out to that list is too long to go through right now, but folks that I'd only known online that I met in Nashville who saw me and were like, "Oh, yeah, you look exactly like the drawing of your face." Okay. Which is great. Shout out to Rachel Hurley, who's an incredible publicist who does such great work. And was so good to us. That's actually, I think that's a quote from her, actually. I need to attribute that properly. But yeah, it just that part I don't like either. I don't like the promotion part. I'm proud of the show. I'm happy with the show, but it's kind of weird because I don't know in today's world, you're going to use Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, right? TikTok maybe. We don't have a TikTok. I got rid of Facebook a couple years ago. And Twitter I've had for so long that there's a lot of me in it. And so I do promote the show on Twitter. But I also like sharing things about me, and maybe that's marketing in itself, but I don't want to mix those things, and that's what's so hard about it.
Well, it's tough, too, because I think there is something to be said about having a professional persona, you know. Here's Jason's dog, and also listen to this next episode of The Marinade.
Yeah.
You know, that's a tough sell, I think, to your point, to outside artists, too, to say, you know, maybe if you're a massive megastar, you can get away with having like a really just a who cares, you're going to do it anyways attitude. But I'm sure
Right.
for you, even now, it's still a constant thing of saying, hey, I want people to take it seriously. I want them to know, how serious I am about having a real in-depth conversation. And that's kind of tough sometimes when your persona can get mixed up with your personal.
Yeah, but it is also the Marinade with Jason Earle. So
Yeah.
so I am kind of saying like it is about my guest, but it is also, there's a certain amount of ego involved of like, hey, this is my thing too.
Yeah.
If you're going to start a podcast that's structured this way, at least, there's a certain amount of like, I think I have something to say,
Yeah.
and I would be disingenuous if I said that I didn't, because I do think I have something to say, and that's part of why I have the show.
What's interesting, that makes me think of a John Mulaney quote. John Mulaney famously made the TV show Mulaney, and it fell kind of flat. It was canceled after something like 6 episodes.
Yeah.
And he said, the sad thing is that you only get one show with your name on it. So I think it's funny that you're saying
Mulaney
that.
again.
Yeah, exactly. John. But but I think that's a really interesting point. I think the Marinade with Jason Earle, you're right, it's a full sentence, right? It's not
Yeah.
the Marinade. Even though we call it that so often, but that's a great point. It's you're adding yourself into the endeavor, and so I think that's a great point you bring up of saying, yeah, I mean, that's part of it, right? It's your conversation and I think that's one of the things I love about the podcast is obviously I like you and your conversational style, but it's true. I mean, you definitely get in there, right? You put a lot of yourself into that conversation.
A ton.
You're not the dead interviewer just saying,
Right. Well, I think that allows me to go deeper with guests too. Is that I am willing
certainly.
to go there with them, and I want to. I want, because these are people I respect. So, like, I want to hear what they have to say about, and find common ground about similar things we might be going through, or similar, not necessarily challenges or negative experiences. Sometimes it's something positive, something joyous that I want to share with them about my life that they can relate to, and so I think it allows for us to get a little bit deeper, and I think that's true for conversation in general and for relationships in general, is that if you're willing to give a little bit more of yourself, that the other person is going to reciprocate, is more likely to reciprocate.
Yeah.
And so
But it's a trust thing too.
It is a trust thing.
It's absolutely a trust thing to say, hey, I'm out here, I'm making sure that, it's, I'm not here. And to your point, you're an independent artist, you're an independent, entity.
Yeah.
You're not coming here from Rolling Stone saying, I'm looking to give an interview. You're sitting here saying, I just want to talk. I want to pick your brain and see what's working, and how you work.
Just a real conversation. I'm not looking for a hot take.
Yeah.
I think that's another thing that makes it kind of successful is like, and this is where I suck at marketing too, is like there'll be great lines in the show, great moments, and almost never. I try to do that. I try to put quotes every once in a while out on social media just to pique people's interest, because it'll hook me. I'm susceptible to sort of a clickbait sort of thing, but I shy away from it to some extent, because that one quote in the middle of an hour conversation where we've spanned so much, we've covered so much ground, isn't going to give you a good picture of what the experience was like. And I may have said something incredibly vulnerable that then led to the guest saying the thing,
right,
that comes out as the pull quote. That's why we just got to make it big time, and I can hire a publicist for the Marinade, and then they can pull the quotes.
Yeah, they can do all the marketing.
They do all that, and
then eventually the editor.
I'll just put out pictures of Nonsense and Conundrum, my beautiful dogs, and then the publicist can do all that work.
That's a good point. From somebody who's obviously a patreon.com/the Marinade.
Marinade podcast /Marinade podcast
/Marinade podcast. Somebody who's obviously been your friend prior to this endeavor, watched you through it. So much of my understanding of it is seeing the finished product. I don't get the opportunity to see the struggle, but I also don't get to pick your brain as much as I'd love to know, what do you want next, right? You're like, hey, the Marinade keeps going. It keeps getting more successful. What's your dream, right? You've talked about dream guests, and, I shout out to the Patreon. I think, there's lots of content there for like Jason's journeys, and you talk a lot about that stuff that I think doesn't have a home in the Marinade proper.
Yeah.
But, what do you think about when you think this is what I want, right? This is what I would love to see in 5, 10, however many years you're blessed to keep producing it,
Yeah. Every time Brian Koppelman, who's kind of my unofficial, he doesn't know it, podcast mentor, puts out Ask Me Anything on Twitter, I ask him questions to try to pick his brain, because I think his show is amazing and kind of sort of where I would want to head in terms of my show's different. It is different, but I think I've borrowed a lot of ideas from him, and been inspired by the way that he interviews people. I always want to ask him, he's never answered it, so hopefully one of these days he will, what his long-term vision for the Moment podcast is. Because my question about the way I think about it isn't necessarily what do I want for the show. It's more like what is going to happen with the medium in general.
Sure.
So, and how much longer are podcasts going to be so wildly popular? I mean, there's so many podcasts.
Yeah.
And every day somebody's starting one. And then, people will start one. I think about Arian Foster, the former NFL star, had a podcast that was pretty good. He's a really sharp guy and thoughtful guy, and so he would talk sports sometimes, but for the most part he was talking about philosophy and life with different guests from all walks of life. And I found it interesting, and then it just went away, and I don't think I'll this thing, as long as what I picture is, as long as the podcast medium continues to exist as it does, I think I'll keep making the show, because it just gives me such joy and I grow so much from it. It gives me so much. Right? So if it started to take from me, then I would have to reevaluate things, but I can't imagine that it would. So if it exists in this medium, if the medium exists the way that it does and functions the way that it does in society now, I don't know, man. I don't know that I would think about what I want from it 5 or 10 years from now. I think from a creative standpoint, I want to write novels. I would like to get some of my music related stuff published in larger publications someday. I would love to see my byline in No Depression, or even Rolling Stone for that matter. That's shooting kind of high, but
go for Pitchfork.
Yeah, I don't think Pitchfork's. I don't think I'm geared for Pitchfork. I don't think I'm critical enough for Pitchfork. I'd be like, oh man, 10 out of 10.
Okay, well
they put their heart and soul into it.
That's really funny that you mentioned that, because I think that's one of the fascinating things. And I don't know, man. I mean, you're more plugged in, but I think there's a whole generation of people who I think are moving away from wanting to get reviews on stuff people don't like.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is people don't want to hear, your podcast. You couldn't do an episode with somebody you don't care about, aren't interested in, and I think that's one of the strengths of the podcast and the medium is you've got an audience who just wants to hear something good.
Yeah.
And they don't want to hear about how this album, you like their earlier stuff or stuff like that. You don't, you're not comparing the artists or anything like that, because it is about process.
Yeah.
It's not about necessarily even what comes out at the end, though often you guys talk about that. A lot more of it is devoted to getting in their brain and seeing what makes them tick and how they work. And, over a long period of time, you get to see this breadth of creatives and how different each one of them responds to that.
I have no interest in tearing down somebody's art. I just don't find it interesting at all. I know how hard people work. I know how hard I work on my art. I know how hard people work on their records and on their films and on their visual art. I live with an artist. I see it every day. I know how much people put into it. I have no interest in being a critic in that way. I'm not saying there isn't a place for critique. I'm just not interested in it. I don't read Pitchfork reviews.
Right.
You know, I probably did. You know, I did.
Yeah.
I did in my 20s. But then I got to a place where I started to understand how much people put into a record. And every episode, I learned more about that. And as I think about my own, I may have enough of my own songs now that I want to make a record. And I think about, like, that's a daunting thing. I mean, to put all that work in. I remember being a young person listening and consuming music and not truly understanding how much goes into a record and getting frustrated when my favorite artists would not put out a record every couple of years, year or two, you know, and being like, where's the next one kind of thing.
Right.
And, well, that's because it's fucking hard, and it can be very expensive. It can be it is exhausting most of the time for people to make a record. And so even whether it's music, film, whatever it is, and I think more so with music, I don't want to be a critic because I dabble in it, you know. I don't dabble in filmmaking, so sometimes I might watch a film and be like, you know, or that sucked. We just talked about the Avengers movies earlier. Yeah. How I wasn't interested. But I'm not about to go out and write a think piece about how the Avengers sucks.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
If you like the Avengers, good for you.
Thankfully, that's not your job.
You know? Like, if it gives you joy, that's awesome, man. If you liked Guardians of the Galaxy, cool. I thought it was dumb. But if you liked it, great. Right. You know? Like, you don't need me going, the thing that you like, I think, isn't good or doesn't have value. That's not interesting to me.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, you know, I think the classic hot take, right, is, you know, for artists, for musicians specifically, right, you've got your whole life to write your first album, you got 6 months to write your second. Yeah. And I think that's funny, even with your earlier comment about podcasts, right? Yeah. Like, so often we think of creatives as an eternal well of, you know, there's something there, right? Yeah. And there's no real room for a J.D. Salinger in music, right? Right. Write a defining piece and then never do anything ever, right? Yeah, yeah. And I think the podcast is very interesting, you know, at some point, right, the Marinade's going to wrap up. Yeah. And it'll be interesting to look at it on the shelf, so to speak, and say, that's it.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder about that because I don't know. Again, I think about that on a macro level. I'm really interested in, but I'm interested in it, and I have no entrance point into understanding it. You and I were talking the other night. We sat around this very fire when I first got to town, and we stayed up way past our bedtimes, and we were talking about cryptocurrency and and investments. You know, I guess that wasn't too late. I guess your wife was still here, and we were still kind of early. Yeah. But just like the idea of predicting what's gonna what's gonna pop and what's not and what's gonna happen in the future, I don't have a brain for that for whatever reason. When it comes to certain things, there are things that, well, let me explain, because I think I do have, by benefit of having read history, I can see political and social things changing before they happen. But the modern American fascist movement, anybody who's read 5 minutes of history could have seen what we're experiencing right now. Yeah. But I don't have the ability with technology to make any sense out of like what the future is going to hold. We were talking also about like when iPods came out and how was it your brother was like, man, these mini discs are the future.
Yeah, he had the option to buy a mini disc player or the very first iPod, and he's like, nah, man, the mini discs.
That's it. That's the future. And I'll be honest, I was with your brother at the time. You know, I was like, this iPod thing doesn't make any damn sense.
And so Ride or die mini disc listener.
Yeah. So I don't have I've never really had an ability to predict technology-wise what's going to happen. I didn't think podcasts made any sense until you're really good at turning me on to things that you know I'm going to like. I actually, you're not on social media, so you didn't see this. I posted on my Instagram about how, what a great gift giver you are, and how
that's really great. Would not think to compliment somebody in a medium they will never be able to see.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't want your ego to get too inflated, you know.
That's
I don't want you to. But it was in the context of just talking about the music festival I went to last week in Gasparilla Music Fest and what a gift it was. And I was just talking about how like you have this ability to give people things they didn't know that they wanted or needed. And you gave me Sylvanesso's first record as a housewarming gift. And I fell in love with the band. And I got to see them last weekend. It was such a great time. I wouldn't have been nearly as fired up, probably. They would have wandered into my life at some point. But there was an investment in having that. It's like a limited edition vinyl that you gave me, you know? And I'd never heard of the band when you gave it to me. But you knew I was going to like it.
Oh, yeah.
But I think what I was trying to say was that, like, the ability to sort of predict what people are going to like and understand what people are going to like before it happens, you know, is something I'm not very good at. I've never understood. Like, I didn't think the iPod made any sense. I thought Facebook was the dumbest idea ever when it came out. My buddy was trying to get me on it. Now, at the time, it was only if you had a college
the EDU
email address, you know. And so there was nothing to it. You could message people, and then you could have your picture.
Yeah,
and
which we were all on AIM, and it's like, why would I need another
messaging
service? I've got AIM. It'll never die.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. I've got everyone's email address that I need to be in touch with.
That's exactly right. My brother did that about texting. He told me once I was in high school, so I'm dating myself a little bit here, and he's like, why would you ever need to text anybody? You could just call them.
That's 100% what I said.
Yep.
And text messages were expensive when they first started.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
10 cents or something every text
every
message.
time. Even if you received them, they cost money. So I didn't think, I'm just bad at, like, predicting what's going to make sense and what's not. Shit, man. I'll go all the way back to debit cards. I remember being a kid. I was young when debit cards became a thing, but still, I remember being like, that's dumb. You know, that doesn't sound like it makes any sense to me. You just take cash. It's pretty simple. It's a perfect system. So, like, I'm not good at predicting. I like technology to an extent. I'm just not good at predicting what's going to make it and what's not. So if podcasts go in a different direction, you know, will the Marinade pivot like 8 months too late?
Sure.
You know, probably. Will I figure it out and be able to adjust? Maybe. Will it matter by then? I don't know. I'm really proud of what we've already done. You know, I have no intentions of stopping. But you told me when I started this thing that I would have interviewed BJ Barham twice and James McMurtry and Todd Snyder, and I would have gotten a chance to sit down and become acquainted with people like Micah Schnabel, whose art I love so much, and that I would get to talk with Erica Winterstrom and Sarah Shook and, you know, Sadler Vaden and, hell, half of Driving and Crying. You know, like, just all, I could go on and on, of course. G Love. The fact that, I mean, 18-year-old me listened to G Love.
One day you're gonna talk directly to him.
Yeah, like there's no way I would have thought I was going to talk directly to G Love at 18.
Yeah.
You know, and not only that, but sit down for an hour with them. And coincidentally, that one was going to be episode 50. It's episode 51 with an asterisk.
Got bumped. You know, it's funny you say, you know, hearing you talk about it too. I think the interesting thing is, you know, how do you think? I think so. An interviewer, right? The goal is to be a kind of semi-objective observer, right? And this is not an interview show; it's a conversational show,
right?
And the nature of a conversation is it goes both ways, right?
Yeah.
And so, what do you think? How do you think you've been affected by your guests so far? Like, I mean, I have my own kind of back assumptions about certain things. I think, you know, I listened to that episode with Micah talking about his novel, and I wonder, you know, in the back of my head, was that when the novel really started to get into your mind or something like that? You know, what do you think you've been affected? How's the Marinade changed you and your creative process?
Oh my God, dude. I mean, immeasurable. Like that. Yes, when Micah was talking about his novel, that was part of what I did. Like, Micah works hard, and like, and just his work ethic and what he's able to create inspires me immensely. And when he was talking about his novel, and that, if you remember, he talks about, like, it's one of my favorite things that we've ever gotten on tape. How he, like, couldn't afford a computer, so he had a typewriter. He wrote that fucking novel on a typewriter.
That's insane.
And he would, like, type it up. And also, like, what's wrong with the world that someone as talented as Micah and gives as much as Micah, you know, has to, like,
should be lacking.
Yeah, is lacking a computer. You know, like, fucking A, man. Like, that guy's a treasure. I mean, a national treasure. Like, he's he's so talented and he's so smart and so loving, like such a giving person and loving person, and writes incredible songs. But he talks in that episode about typing up his novel and then literally taking the piece of paper, balling it up and throwing it away if it was no good, and writing all day like that. And so as agonizing as that sounds, it also sounds like the most romantic damn thing in the world to me, you know?
Well,
And
it's the idea of shooting on film, right?
Yeah.
You only think about a film camera is you've only got X amount of shots, so you're gonna I mean the effort, right?
Yeah.
So who knows? I mean, to your point, you get a unlimited amount of pages in a computer, and
Yeah.
you know,
But
put
it's
it out
also,
there.
I think, the dedication
certainly.
that, you know, I think it's the dedication of him sitting there at the typewriter, getting up, having his coffee, getting to work on this novel that's not his primary source of income, right? He's a songwriter. He's a performer. That's his main gig. And as this kind of side thing, he's sitting down and doing that work all day in like what sounds like kind of an agonizing thing, but when you're fueled by creativity that way, like for me that sounds so idyllic because I just want to sit down and write all day. You know, like I want to do that. Now, I recognize that the trade-off would be really struggling to like pay your fucking bills. If I were to do that, if I were to go out and do that, and I am not in a place where I can do that right now, you know, I haven't set my life up like that. The way that he challenged my thinking, I guess I learned more from that both Micah conversations than I realized, than I really talk about. But there's something he said in that first interview that changed the way I just speak about place. So he said to me, I made a joke, and it wasn't a good joke. It was just a one-off, like, making a connection kind of joke. That about how, like, people from Ohio and Florida, I forget what I said, but it was something about people from Ohio and Florida being really proud of where they're from is the gist of it. And he just got, like, Michael's a really nice guy. He's also can get real serious. And he just goes like, well, that's the stupidest fucking thing I've ever heard. And then he just went on about, like, how stupid it is to be proud of where you're from because you don't have any choice.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
And
It's the root of nationalism, right?
yeah, 100%.
Convince somebody that the one thing that they have nothing that revolves not around them in the slightest is the most important thing in the world.
They have no control over that. And it got me thinking about so many other aspects of life. I don't think he meant it to get me thinking about other aspects of life. But, dude, it has made me think so much about just existence, which I guess I'm prone to think about anyway, but just about, like, whether or not to have kids and, like, how much pressure that is to bring a human into the world who has no choice as to whether they're brought in the world or not. And all these kind of cosmic questions came out of that conversation. Man, I could do this all day of, like, moments where artists say something to me that just the way that that person was thinking about the world made me then rethink not only the particular topic we were discussing, but rewired the way that I think about other aspects of my life and the world around me. So the Marinade has given more than just the creative process and the lessons I've learned from the creative process, which just about each conversation I learned something new about process. But it's also given me tons and tons of life lessons and things to consider about how to navigate the difficult questions in the world. Because I think without artists, there are certainly other disciplines and other people in the world who question things and question the way things are. But we need art as that reflection of those questions. And we need artists to push our thinking about societal questions and issues and to provide their lens. And a lot of times their lens is derided by the system as like overly idealistic or Pollyannish or whatever. Well, you know what? We need that. I think we need to have the lens of an artist to say, well, it's only not possible because we say it's not possible.
Right. Well, I mean, to that point, I think, I read quite a bit of science fiction, and I think that's such a strong argument for science fiction.
Yeah.
Is science fiction is us dreaming about the future, and, so much of what, it's not just about the dream, it's about the actual engineer who grows up reading about Star Trek.
Yeah.
Or listening to Star Trek or watching Star Trek and being like, well, what if, right?
Yeah.
What if we could have communicators in our hands that would allow us to talk vast distances?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, how many cartoons, Jetsons, whatever, had a video phone?
Yeah.
I mean, I remember growing up, I don't know about you, but growing up as a kid, it was almost like a foregone conclusion we'd have a video phone.
Yeah.
Like at some point in the future, I was like, oh, of course you can have it. And now it's funny because nobody saw it coming the way it did, FaceTime and whatnot.
Right.
But still,
It's
I mean, that's
everywhere
what
now.
it is.
You can do it through your social media apps now.
Yeah.
You can't, but
No.
the rest of us idiots who have social media can.
I mean, I think that shows though to your strength of who you are as a person. The conversation can change you. I think that's such a strength of strength of character to say like, hey, it's not, I don't know. I think you can get really navel gazy, to use it a second time. But you can get really navel gazy and say, well, it's the art is about the conversation and it's about this. And I think it's something to be said about saying like, no, you've taken away, right? You've given to the Marinade, but you've taken away from it as well. And been
Hell
able
yeah.
to change.
Yeah. 100%, man. Yeah, it's made me a better person. The Marinade's made me a better person, and that coincided with a lot of other things in my life. Meeting Chris and is starting a life together, and just getting out also of just the environments that I was in that were kind of like suppressing my creativity, and acknowledging that like I need it. I need to create. I need to write. And we talked earlier, because we haven't really seen each other since the pandemic began. You and I were talking yesterday or the day before about how we both struggled to read, and we're both voracious readers. And we struggled to read during the pandemic. We were too anxious. It was hard to stay focused. But one thing that I didn't have any trouble with was writing. And the reason I didn't have any trouble with writing, in fact, I increased the amount of writing I was doing at the beginning of the pandemic, was because I needed it. Like I had to have it. It's the way I process things. And it calms me. It helps me to it levels me. It helps me to mellow out. And without it, and without consuming it, that was a struggle to not consume it for that time. I tried. I don't know about you, but I was like laboring through books.
Yeah, absolutely. It was arduous. I mean, it was like a page. I would just do the thing. You're reading the page over and over and over, and nothing's sticking.
Yeah.
Nothing's sticking.
Yep. Exactly. I'm just thinking about like, is this the end of society? Am I gonna contract this thing and die? Are my parents gonna contract this thing and die?
Right. Yeah. Both of us have older parents, and
yeah.
I mean, my mom told me up front. Granted, my family is pretty on the nose with some things, and death is one of them. My mom just told me my dad's a lifelong smoker. She just said, if he gets it, he dies.
Yeah.
It's just that simple.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, no, I feel
It's
you
so
100%.
heavy, dude.
And right, and all that's running him back, that low-level anxiety, running 24/7, not going out, no distractions.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. No distraction. That's what writing. I can always write. I will say I'm blessed in that I can always write. I'm really fortunate. I don't get writer's block. Some things are better than others, but I never get stuck. I never look at the blank page and find it intimidating. I never look for an excuse to avoid writing. I beg for opportunities to sit down and write. That's why I like flights so much. Maybe not the last one I took that took 5 hours to get here because I was on the runway for 3 hours on the way to Minneapolis. But I love flights for that reason, because you can't do much.
Yeah.
I always have a notebook, and I do a ton of writing on planes, because it's like I'm not going to sleep. I can sleep just about anywhere except on a Spirit Airlines flight. So I
Can't recline.
I can't recline. If I can recline, I can pass out. But on a Spirit Airlines flight, I'm going to write. And I do that even on other flights. Chris will pass right out. She'll fall asleep on my shoulder, and I'll write 5 pages on the flight, because I need it. And so we kind of went on a tangent there. I forgot.
Not in this show.
Yeah, right. I forgot what you were asking me originally.
Well, no, I mean, let's talk about it. I think that's a good segue into your process. I mean, you talk about it with all your guests, and you've definitely talked about it at length, but I think it's interesting to see, what's your process for the marinade? I mean, I think you talk about your process a lot for, writing. Even now, I think writing, because you end up with something, right? You do it for X amount of time, you get 5 pages or whatever.
Yeah.
What's your process for the marinade?
Well,
It's a different creative aspect, I know, because it's a lot more collaborative. But what does that look like?
yeah, I'm glad you asked. Let me grab a water real quick.
You go grab a water. I'm going to put some logs on this fire. Jason, when you're editing this, I'm watching you walk back with a water and a wine. So
It wasn't an excuse. But I wanted some more wine, and I'm a grown-ass man on mini vacation.
there you go.
So
So let's get back to it.
Awesome,
So
by the way, but anyway,
we were talking about what's your process for the marinade? It's a different creative endeavor because it's collaborative.
Yeah.
But what does that look like? I don't think that's something you have talked to much on the podcast because it's kind of again a little.
it's not about me. It's kind of self-indulgent.
Yeah,
I
it's
guess.
pretty self-indulgent to tell,
Yeah.
especially with a lot of music artists to be like, let me tell you about
Let
my
me tell you about how I
editing
do my
process."
thing. Todd Snyder. Yeah, it's evolved a lot, Peter.
Sure, it starts with the Toshiba.
Yeah, it starts with the Toshiba. No, I think so. I spend a lot of time researching, and the way I do that, our mutual friend Tanner once said to me, maybe the smartest person I know. He said, the ideal work situation would be that you find a job that is like, let me listen to this and make sure it's not like, I think it's weirdly okay in this spot. Yeah, I don't know.
You want to relocate?
We might need to go inside.
That's fine.
I hope we didn't just miss out on a lot of good stuff.
20 minutes.
Yeah.
Personality. My late 30s over sexuality. Over sexuality. Oh, I can't help it. How I love you. I can't help that I need help. If I don't freeze in Minneapolis, I can make it by myself. If I don't freeze in Minneapolis, I can make it by myself. If I don't freeze in Minneapolis, I'll make it by myself. If I don't freeze in
Me, everyone. Thank you so much to my good friend Peter Haroldson, who you can find nowhere online. Thank all of you for listening. We are coming up on 5 years of episodes and about 6.5 years after the first steps were taken to make this thing a reality. Thank you so much to everybody who has listened to an episode, everyone who's spread the word and told a friend, everybody who's contributed financially, who's bought a hat or a t-shirt, who's sent us a tweet, who's sent us an email, who's made a comment on a post on Instagram, where however it is that you've shown your appreciation, thank you, thank you, thank you. I just got an email, and it was a deeply personal email, so I'm not going to say exactly who it was or what they said, but it was just so kind. It was someone who's new to the Marinade, who would come to the Marinade via the Kristen Arnett episode, and it's just a thoughtful message about how that particular episode resonated with this person. And those little things mean a lot, y'all. Even if it's just a tweet or a direct message or something saying, hey, I really enjoyed that particular episode. Thanks so much. That stuff goes a long way, and we're just really, really grateful for all the love you've shown the show. MarinadePodcast.com for all things The Marinade, including written pieces, photography, and more. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Subscribe and give us a 5-star rating on your podcast app. Tell a friend about the show. These are all free ways to support The Marinade. And if you really like what we're doing, please consider joining our Patreon community, where for just a few bucks a month, you can gain access to Patreon exclusive content like our show Jason's Journey, where I talk about the moments that continue to shape my creative life, and provide a window into the process of making the marinade. I also post what I'm getting down on, which is an examination of the art that is inspiring me at the moment. Sometimes we get together for Patreon happy hours, patreon.com/marinade podcast if you're interested. And as a reminder, part 2 of this conversation is going to be available over on that website. If you want to support the show financially, Patreon's a monthly commitment. So if you want to support the show financially, but you don't want to commit to a monthly subscription, you can Venmo or PayPal us. It's just at the Marinade. And all that money goes right back into making the show. Another thing I want to encourage you to check out is our weekly title playlist called Marinade Musings. You can find that on our social media pages or by typing Marinade Musings into the title search. Title has a free tier now, so if you were holding back from using it because of the paywall, fret no more. Marinade Musings is just a short list of songs I find interesting, just stuff that I'm letting kind of marinate. I want to thank Patrick Hagerman, who you can find at hagermanmusic.com. You can also find him over on the social media apps. Once again, the song you're hearing is Minneapolis, and that's by Patrick Hagerman. Give him a follow so you don't miss any announcements about his forthcoming album. You're not going to want to miss it. Patrick is a great dude, a great friend, and an incredible songwriter, and I'm super excited for his songs to get a little bit broader audience once that record is ready. All right, y'all. That's all the housekeeping I got for you. It seems like every time we come to each other here, some other right has been taken away, and I'm recording this 3 days after the U.S. Supreme Court overturned a woman's right to an abortion with the Dobbs decision. We're at another inflection point in American history, and call it what it is. It's fascist zealots who are taking away fundamental rights. We're not arguing taxes right here. We're not talking about the nuances of foreign policy. We're talking about zealots who are taking away fundamental rights and being cheered on by a minority of the American public. And I want to say without question, this is really important to me, that I support a woman's right to choose whether to have an abortion for whatever reason. That's up to her. Personal medical decisions should not be dictated by the state. And I know folks are discouraged, and I get it. I'm with you, but I still want to encourage you to vote. Fundamental rights we're talking about are being taken away. And you can be disappointed with the Democrats in America and also recognize that the alternative is a fascist party that is stripping away democratic institutions and basic freedoms. All right, y'all. I love you. I appreciate you. Michaela Ann is up next. We just recorded today. I should get it up to you a week from today. It was a deep, emotional conversation, perhaps the most personal Marinade episode yet. Definitely up there. So I'm really excited for you to hear it. Just get ready. It's heavy, but I think beautiful. Until next time, go out and create something. Cheers, y'all.
Wheels down in another town. I thought you said you'd stick around, and I wonder now if love is gonna cost my life. Something in my chest feels like a butcher knife. 4 days in a hotel, we'll be going home. I wish I could remember how to be alone. How to be alone. Oh, I can't help it, how I love you, and I can't help that I need help. If I don't freeze in Minneapolis, I can make it by myself. If I don't freeze in Minneapolis, I can make it by myself. Go on, play another song. Well, I thought that you were never wrong. Consequences hover like an army drone. waiting to declare this kingdom overthrown. The fabric I thought tearing turns out wasn't sewn. When I got your message on my telephone, on my telephone, oh, I can't help it, how I love you. I can't help that I need help. If I don't freeze in Minneapolis, I can make it by myself. If I don't freeze in Minneapolis, I can make it by myself. You said, say what's in your head. I thought you would rather see me dead. 60 days clean sober wasn't long enough, and better than I've ever been ain't good enough. Better than I've ever been ain't good enough. Well, who's gonna be good enough? Oh, I can't help it, how I love you. I can't help that I need help. If I don't freeze in Minneapolis, I can make it by myself. If I don't freeze in Minneapolis, I'll make it by myself. What's it to you anyway? You've got other games to play. I mistook your compliments for loyalty. I guess I should be thankful for your feeding me, pointing out my flaws and personality. My late 30s over sexuality, over sexuality. Oh, I can't help it, how I love you. I can't help that I need help. If I don't freeze in Minneapolis, I can make it by myself. If I don't freeze in Minneapolis, I can make it by myself. If I don't freeze in Minneapolis, I'll make it by myself. If I don't freeze in Minneapolis, I'll make it by myself.
Oh,